Today, cigarettes are a global staple. But before 1914, the American middle class viewed them as a vice for criminals and outcasts. In Britain, smoking them was often dismissed as unmanly and effeminate, a weak alternative to the traditional pipe. The pushback was intense. Between 1895 and 1921, 50 states temporarily banned cigarette sales. Influential figures like Henry Ford publicly argued that the history of almost any criminal would reveal an inveterate cigarette smoker. Even moral institutions like the YMCA actively campaigned against the product, labeling the cigarette a growing evil that threatened to enfeeble an entire generation of young men. The cigarette was on a definitive trajectory to be entirely eradicated from American society, just like alcohol would be under Prohibition. That is, until a global catastrophe interrupted. The outbreak of the First World War subjected millions of men to unprecedented psychological and physical trauma in the trenches. Militaries faced a logistical nightmare. They had to manage terrified, hungry, and shell-shocked troops surrounded by daily calamity. They quickly discovered that nicotine was an effective operational tool for calming those nerves. It also offered a physiological advantage for supply lines. Smoking artificially suppresses the appetite, which meant armies could feed their soldiers less food while keeping morale intact. To maintain military efficiency, governments threw their moral health concerns out the window. Militaries effectively became the world's largest tobacco cartels, prioritizing soldier nerves over the very public health concerns they had previously championed. The habit was structurally implemented from the top down. Militaries actively integrated cigarettes as a mandatory part of basic combat rations, handing them out right alongside daily food supplies. The reversal of former opponents was staggering. The YMCA, which had just spent years campaigning against tobacco, pivoted and began freely handing cigarettes to soldiers at the front lines and in military canteens. Top military brass viewed tobacco as equally critical to the war effort as ammunition. General John J. Pershing stated, "You ask me what we need to win this war. I answer, tobacco, as much as bullets." By the end of the First World War, the military had successfully engineered a massive, captive, and chemically dependent consumer base. When the armistice was signed, the U.S. Army sent home a new generation of addicts, creating a vast, untapped market for tobacco companies. Advertisers seized the moment. They hijacked the image of the brave returning soldier to wash away the cigarette's old stigma as a criminal vice. Associating the cigarette with the military completely reversed its gender perception. Once dismissed as a weak or unmanly novelty, the cigarette was rebranded as the quintessential symbol of rugged American masculinity. By tethering the product to the soldier, advertisers converted a trauma-induced wartime coping mechanism into a permanent marker of civic identity and patriotism. The Second World War forced U.S. cigarette production into overdrive. Yearly production climbed from 172.5 billion in 1939 to 267.8 billion in 1945. The armed forces overseas siphoned off 30% of that supply, creating a domestic cigarette famine and panic buying back home. To maintain growth, the cartel expanded its demographic reach. They launched targeted ad campaigns aimed at the millions of women entering the wartime industrial workforce. They even weaponized the idea of sacrifice. Lucky Strike launched a campaign claiming they removed their signature green dye to save copper for the war effort. In reality, their old dye used chromium, not copper, and they simply used the war as a patriotic excuse for a planned redesign. WW2 proved that patriotism could mask mass addiction as a form of civic duty, making the cigarette a permanent fixture of American life. Following the war, the U.S. tobacco industry had massively overshot demand. They were sitting on piles of excess product with nowhere to put it. The U.S. government stepped in to save them. Using the Marshall Plan, they bought up this excess tobacco and shipped it to Europe for free. It eventually made up over 4% of all relief shipments. Flooding the market with free American tobacco devastated local economies. In Greece, domestic tobacco farmers saw their livelihoods threatened as cheap, subsidized American imports undercut their entire industry. The U.S. government prioritized its domestic tobacco cartel over allied economies. They used addiction as an economic tool. hoping a steady supply of luxury goods would soften post-war austerity and prevent the spread of communism. Meanwhile, a bizarre historical irony was playing out in Europe. The Nazi Party had been deeply anti-smoking, aggressively banning it in public spaces under the guise of social purity. Because the Nazis restricted smoking, pro-tobacco activists post-war successfully branded new public health campaigns against cigarettes as fascist. This political weaponization led to a massive boom in smoking across a traumatized, liberated Europe. The cigarette conquered the world through the cold logic of military logistics, the weaponization of patriotism in advertising, and its calculated use as a geopolitical tool by governments.